Hey, it's Steve. In this video, we're going to take a look at how I built the benchwork for this 2x4 foot N scale layout. Let's watch. First off, here is a material list for what I used to build all of the layout benchwork. This isn't necessarily the best use of supplies and the cheapest way of doing things, as I use individual 2x4 foot birch panels along with some 4-foot long pieces of poplar and one single 6-foot piece of pine. So cutting the birch panels down from a 4x8 foot sheet of plywood and using longer pieces of lumber would actually probably be a little bit cheaper, but with the small sizes of the pieces, I was able to get all the materials in the back seat of our smaller vehicle, and it was easier to make sure that the plywood pieces I selected weren't warped and were all the same size. With most projects, I like to try out at least one new idea, and with this one I wanted to try to build a base that was sturdy but also very lightweight. And since it was only 2x4 feet in size, it wasn't really going to be that heavy anyway, but being 3 levels, I wanted to save some weight here and there. And so for the base of this layout, I decided to try using 1/4 inch thick birch plywood, along with a layer of 1 inch thick insulation foam board in the middle. And with everything glued together, I figured it would be extremely rigid, but still very lightweight. I use birch plywood since that usually weighs less than regular plywood made out of pine, plus it usually has a smoother surface since it's typically used in furniture. And the foam layer makes everything much more rigid and allows for a place to run wires. And I probably should have cut channels for the wires ahead of time, but it was easy to come back later on and drill some holes with some of my long drill bits. If I was doing this again, I probably would just end up using a 24-inch wide hollow core door and cut that to length, and then maybe fill in that cut end with some pieces of plywood or dimensional pine or something like that, and that would make everything a lot easier to do. Anyway, since I needed to be able to attach wood sides to the layout base in some way, and the 1/4 inch plywood and the foam layers really weren't going to be able to hold screws very well, I decided to add blocks around the perimeter cut from 1/2 inch plywood that I had on hand. And I needed a wood layer that was 1 inch thick to equal the thickness of the foam board, but if you use dimensional lumber like a 1x2, that's only going to be 3/4 of an inch thick. And I probably could have cut down some other wood to be a 1 inch thickness and used that, but I had the 1/2 inch thick plywood already, so I just went ahead and cut some strips of that and then chopped that down. Again, just buying a door would probably be an easier way to make this base, or just doing regular framing with maybe 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch thick plywood for the base and some 1x2s or 1x3s to add some dimensional stability. Anyway, I stacked up the plywood blocks in the corners and in the middle of each side, along with the very middle of the layout. And so I had to cut out sections of the foam board here and there where those blocks were to allow them to fit in there nicely. But then once I had that done, I glued everything down with some foam-safe construction adhesive and the wood blocks with wood glue. Then I applied more glue and adhesive on top of the foam and wood blocks and attached the top layer. And now what I should have actually done was use a putty knife to spread out the foam board adhesive, or simply just use wood glue everywhere, since the thicker beads of the adhesive are kind of hard to squish flat without a lot of heavy weight on top. And so I walked back and forth over the top of the layout base to help squish everything together, but it was still hard to get everything firmly spread out. I tried clamping things to help hold everything together while it was drying, but I didn't have enough clamps for that to work, and plus I couldn't really squeeze the middle areas together very well. So instead I stacked up weights on the base, and eventually what I ended up doing was grabbing the punching and kicking bag my son and I use for Taekwondo practice, since that weighs about 250 pounds, and just put that on top of the base to help squish everything flat while everything dried. I did also put a few screws into the wood blocks in the corners to help make sure those were nice and tight as well. But once everything dried, I removed those wood screws since they weren't really needed, and you can see here that I still, in the end, ended up with a nice, flat, rigid, and lightweight panel. I sanded the sides with a sanding block, but I grabbed the orbital sander for doing the edges, as some of the plywood blocks in the corners and in the middle of the sides there had shifted a little bit when I was trying to pile up weights on top of everything, and so they kind of stuck out the edges a little bit, and so those had to be sanded flush. Next, I worked on attaching the sides to the layout base. I used 1/2 inch thick poplar boards that were 6 inches wide and 48 inches long for the layout sides, but 1x6 clear pine would work just as well. I clamped a 1x3 along one edge to act as a temporary spacer, and then applied a layer of wood glue to the edge of one side of the layout base. And I apparently didn't really want you to see what I was doing exactly, so I kind of worked just off camera. And then using my brad nailer, I put a few brads into each of the wood blocks that were in the layout base to help hold everything secure while the glue dried. You could just use wood screws in those same locations, but using screws just really isn't quite as fun as using a nail gun. Anyway, with the back attached to the first level of the layout, I cut another poplar board to size for one of the layout sides, and then cut some pieces off a 2x2 pine board to help brace those corners. Those would all be hidden anyway, so it didn't really matter what I used for that area, but I have a 2x2 pine board on hand, and so that is what I used. I glued a nail of the 2x2 pine block to one of the corners, but I had to use a clamp to help squeeze the block back against the back board, and then I did the same to the other back corner of the layout. Then I clamped another 1x3 to the edge of a sideboard to act as a spacer again, and applied glue to the side, and then again using brad nails I secured that side to the layout base, and then I flipped the layout over and attached the other side in the same way. At this point, I went ahead and grabbed the plates for attaching legs to the base of the layout along with some of the legs I had on hand. I had some shorter legs that are about 4 inches long, then I have some longer ones that are like 28 to 30 inches long, and then a set that are about 20 inches long but have caster wheels attached to them. And those are the ones that I used here, and those came from an old 4x8 foot HO scale layout that I used to have in our upstairs game room that was actually built from the Woodland Scenics Grand Valley layout kit. Anyway, I screwed the mounting plates to the bottom of the layout and then temporarily added the legs. I eventually came back, removed the plates, and added pine blocks to each of the corners so the plates would have more structure to hang onto. And then once the plates were attached, I threaded on the legs, and then I had a layout that could easily roll around the garage floor as I worked on it. Before working on the next level of the layout, I needed to get the track temporarily put in place on the lowest level. That way I could make sure that none of the wood supports for the second level would cause clearance issues with trains on the first level. And the outer loop of the lower level uses 11-inch radius curves, and the inner loop uses 9 3/4-inch radius curves. I added a set of terminal rail joiners to the outer loop so I could power that, and then run a longer locomotive to make sure there weren't any clearance issues as I worked on placing in the support structure. And here's a list of Kato track that I used for each of these loops, but I'll actually be doing the full track installation wiring in the next video, and so I'll have more details at that time. Anyway, I used 1/2 inch by 3 inch poplar board to act as both a support for the front edge of the second level, as well as the back of what would eventually become a retaining wall along that part of the layout. I used my speed square to figure out what angles I should cut the various pieces so I could join them together with relatively tight seams. I worked my way around the front of the layout, cutting pieces to size as I built the retaining wall and supports. Now sadly, the camera just kept remaining off focus for most of this, but you can kind of see here what the final arrangement of pieces looked like in the end. And I simply glued all these pieces together and to the layout itself and didn't use any screws or nails at this point in time to help secure everything. And here are what the approximate lengths and angles of each of these segments are. And so if you are building it yourself, you can kind of copy that if you want, but you don't really need to follow this exactly, just basically do something relatively similar. I also added some additional wood supports to the interior, making kind of an enclosed box in the middle of the layout. And I'll probably eventually add some additional supports on either side of that box area to really make sure that second level is supported well. And once the glue on those supports had dried, I placed the 3/4-inch plywood base for the middle level on top of all those supports and used a pencil to trace along the edge of the support so I would know where to make my cuts. Then I flipped the board over and used another wood board to kind of act as a straight edge and filled in all the gaps in the marks that I had made. I used my circular saw to make all the cuts, but I did have to finish off a few of the corners with a handsaw. And then a good sanding was needed along those edges, and then after blowing the sawdust off with my leaf blower, I test fit the middle level base on the lower level, and luckily things lined up pretty good, so I didn't really have to adjust anything. And then with the plywood base cut to size, I took another 4-foot long piece of that 6-inch poplar that I had on hand and ran a bead of glue along one edge, and then secured that to the back of the plywood base there with several brad nails. I did end up needing to trim one side slightly, so I just did that with my circular saw and then sanded the cut smooth. I salvaged a brass hinge from an old bookcase that had a drop-down desk and decided to use that hinge on this project. I roughly measured things to get the hinge approximately centered and then used some tape to hold it in place. I put in several screws and then tested the hinge and played around with trying to figure out a solution for the magnetic latch. And what ended up working out was to take 2 of the cabinet latches that I had that had steel plates and magnets and put those together and screw those to the bottom part of the layout. And then I used 2 neodymium magnets on the lid portion. those two neodymium magnets with the magnets on the bottom make for a very strong attachment. You actually have to pull pretty hard on the lid to get it to open. And with that latch figured out, I went back and added in all the remaining screws to the back hinge. Now, I did also salvage a pair of support arms from that same desk that I took the hinge from, and I attached those to the base and the lid, and you can see here how and where I did those. Fortunately, there is still enough clearance under the support arms when they are in a down position so the trains can pass underneath them without any interference. And they seem to work really well, and they do have tension knobs so you can turn those tighter or looser to control how easy or hard it is to open and close the lid. Now, these won't work from keeping the lid from closing shut on you. You'll actually need a pneumatic arm for that, and I use a pneumatic arm on my small 1x5 foot N scale switching layout. But they do keep the lid from opening more than 90 degrees, which is the main problem here, because the top side of the lid is going to have that third level plus a lot of structures and scenery and everything else, and so it's going to be really heavy on that side. And so if you open it up, it's going to have a tendency to open up all the way and flop over. And so these support arms keep it from opening past 90 degrees and falling over. And what I might do as well is come back and add a couple of wood blocks on the back of the lower level there to really help prevent that lid from opening any more than 90 degrees. And with the hinge and support arms attached, I worked on attaching the sides to the middle level. I measured and cut those to length, and then I cut one of the corners off each side, leaving about 1.5 inches below the diagonal cut. And really, I just wanted to have something to really take away that sharp corner that would be there if I had left everything as it was, since that would likely end up being something I would cut my arm on or whatever else. And I could have just rounded it off nicely and done that, but I kind of like the look of having that 45-degree angle cut. And to attach the side pieces, I applied glue along the edge of one side, and then again used my brad nailer to secure everything while the glue dried. A couple of nails did end up poking out the back sides of the back board, but it was easy to come through and just break those off with a pair of pliers. Then I'll just come back with some wood putty and fill in those holes later on. So I got the other side attached, and then I worked on cutting out the board for the very top level. I placed a track loop on another piece of that 1/4-inch birch plywood, and then just used a ruler to kind of mark out the areas I wanted to cut. I cut that out with my circular saw, sanded the edges, and then test fit it on the layout. It turned out that one of the corners was going to overhang the lowest level, and so I had to kind of cut off 1 inch on one side. But instead of using my saw again, I just scored it repeatedly with a knife until I was able to snap it off and have a nice clean break there. And then in order to make sure the supports for the top level wouldn't interfere with the track on the middle level, I again had to go ahead and assemble all the track on that middle level. I followed the track plan I had pulled up on my iPad and worked on assembling all the track pieces. That was a bit tricky in a few spots since not all the Kato track pieces are labeled in the same way, and I had already tossed all the packages that said what pieces were what. And so in a few areas I actually had to take out a ruler and measure how long they were in millimeters to know which track piece to put where. But I got everything assembled okay without too much trouble, and everything seemed to fit pretty nicely. So for the upper level supports, I used a piece of 1x3 clear pine, and I cut pieces to go against the back and sides of the layout, and then along the front edges. And then like with the lower supports, I worked my way around figuring out what angle to cut each piece in order to get it to match up with the upper level and to fit pretty tightly with each other. I marked out where I needed to put the supports with a pencil, and then put down the glue and reattached all the pieces in those areas. And then I kind of came back and filled in some additional interior supports as well to make sure that upper level had plenty of support. And again, if you are building this layout yourself, you don't need to follow these measurements exactly, but here are the measurements in the various points on the whole upper level there if you want to try to cut everything to about the same size. Finally, I used a 1x2 clear pine board to create a 4th level that would hide part of that 3rd level track loop and allow me to raise out some of the structures in that area for a more visually interesting look to that part of the layout. I'll also eventually extend the side walls in this area to add a little bit more protection to those top level buildings, but for now I'll leave that alone. Anyway, you can see that this layout should have a lot of visual interest with all the various levels. I may have some structures also that span multiple levels, kind of going from the 2nd to the 3rd level and so forth, to really kind of tie everything together and look a lot more interesting. So anyway, that's a look at how I built the benchwork for this 2x4 foot N scale layout. Still a few more things left to do in that regard, of course, but in the next video in this series, I'll show you how I installed all the Kato unit track, how I'm doing all the wiring for the track, for the turnouts, and the DC and DCC controls that will be used to control everything on the layout. So watch for that in the next video in this series. But until then, that's all for now, and thanks for watching. Bye.